I want to talk today about the issue of transgender sports participation and maybe even more specifically about trans women in sports. And there's a really specific reason why I want to do this. Last week, I got a call. And as many of you know, when we do calls, they can be about anything. I'm not prepared for them. I'm just answering. And the topics can be anything. And I give my thoughts at the time. And someone called in who said they're on the left. They're not transphobic. They support trans rights at every opportunity. And yet, they said, they recognize that having individuals born biologically male participating in women's sports confers an advantage at a physical level that didn't make sense to them. And I said, not knowing a lot about it, that I also didn't fully understand the logic. But I was aware of the fact that the right often cynically wants to make this the issue about trans rights, when the reality is it's really not the major issue that make it out to be. And it's often used as a way to subtly push back against trans rights more broadly. And today I want to expand on my comments because I actually had some time over the weekend to research the issue in more detail. And the more I learn about it, the more convinced I am that it is a fabricated wedge issue meant to divide people, and in particular to predispose people to be against trans rights. As I researched the issue, one of the things I learned is that hormone replacement therapy, which trans women often avail themselves of over a 1 to 2 year period, comes close to completely eliminating the performance gap that we might imagine exists in some sports when you have individuals born biologically male competing against those born biologically female. Now, I want to put aside for a second the absolutely hysterical notion that some cisgendered men might, quote, pretend to be trans women and go through testosterone blocking treatment merely to compete in women's sports without actually genuinely being trans. Someone willing to do that has bigger issues that need to be resolved, but it's so uncommon that it's not really the issue. The reality is that a study from 2015 called Race Times for Transgender Athletes shows that trans women have essentially no advantage in running over cisgendered women after a period of roughly a year of hormone replacement therapy. There's another more recent study which showed that after 1 year, there is still a modest advantage for trans women, and that the length of time with the hormone replacement therapy maybe should be longer. But to get from that, the idea that this is some kind of, woke cabal looking to impose Mike Tyson or his physical equivalent into women's wrestling against 18-year-old girls, as an example, that's a cartoon. That's ridiculous to suggest that that's predominantly the situation that exists in the world. And I got a few dozen emails about this. And I was completely genuine when I said last week, I've not studied this enough, but at face value, it does raise some questions for me. I still believe this is a complicated issue, but the issue of trans sports is one of many issues related to trans rights, and its importance is being dramatically inflated by certain groups of people for cynical political goals. And what I mean by that is that trans people, intersex individuals, they didn't just start existing in the last 5 years. Sports organizations, endocrinologists, and others, they've known about this for a really long time. And many institutions deal with these things on a case-by-case basis. So when I hear about a political movement that has this knee-jerk reaction to immediately say, no trans women in women's sports, period, it either is coming from just an ignorant place or a place of very bad faith. So I'm glad to have learned more about it and to be able to say more. And that doesn't mean all my questions are answered. With a whole bunch of sports, this is not really an issue. With a certain category of sports, this is in theory an issue. And we have to look at hormone replacement therapy, actual performance differences after 1 or 2 year periods. And I tweeted about this yesterday, and a few people wrote to me and they said, oh, but there's this particular case where someone's skull was broken by a trans woman. Okay, I'm not saying that there are no issues. What I am saying is that pretending this is the issue about trans rights is wrong. I'm not going to say necessarily that it's coming from bad faith. It could be ignorance, but it's wrong to say this is the issue. It has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. And the other thing I would point out is the people that were replying to my tweet kept talking about the 2 or 3 individual instances. Where else would these folks say that because of two or three instances of something, we need to completely change all of the legal and regulatory infrastructure? Look at the number of people that are killed by guns, and yet they say, "Oh, yeah, but I mean, a few hundred incidents. That's not enough to justify changing the rules." But yet here, everybody's pointing to the same two or three incidents over the last 5 years and saying that justifies creating an entirely new regulatory and legal apparatus. It just doesn't pass the sniff test for me, and I've been glad to learn more about it. Doesn't mean every question is answered. Doesn't mean that there aren't some problems to solve or questions to deal with. But I think we need to understand the sort of cynical nature that exists among those who pretend this is the issue, and use it as a smokescreen to deny trans rights more broadly. And unfortunately, that's what's happening all too often.